Doxxed, the podcast.
Allie stands that think we're obsessed with them. I have no clue at all who these people are. That's funny.
Yeah, I think yesterday was the first time I ever heard of that name. So for them to be complaining about how we're all attacking, I mean, it's just that's what's been happening since the very beginning, where Allie was like, "Oh, Jane is stalking me." And it was just like, no, but like, yeah, people are sitting quietly amongst themselves, honestly thinking I'm some kind of attacker of all of them. No, I have other better things to do. So that is a really weird. And I think there's definitely some people that just want to keep it going. And then there's a lot of people that even if they wanted to keep it going a couple months ago are tired now too. So
Yeah, they
yeah,
should be tired because this is stupid. It's
it's
stupid to want to it's stupid to want to be a part of a drama just for the sake of being a part of a drama and no one even knows who you are. Like that's kind of sad and funny.
yeah, I don't think that person played any significant role in any way in any direction at the entire time. And it's weirdly entitled to think that you are involved at this point
Yeah.
or any point. Weird.
Weird energy.
Yeah. And then I was trying to prepare for this episode and I was going down the whole rabbit hole of my because I took a couple different university courses that like informed all this stuff and there's all this articles. So I was just like drowning in articles because this is speaking of very sprawling topics, white supremacy, very sprawling kind of infiltrating everything kind of a topic. Like when you talk about everything, any part of this really it kind of circles back to white supremacy or it ties in or white supremacy is amplifying something about it.
Mhm.
And it's just really hard to even think about where to begin with the topic.
Well, because so many roads seem to lead to white supremacy. Every pipeline anyone talks about, it's a pipeline to white supremacy for sure, to the
Yeah.
alt right.
And again, I think intersectionality is a very, very important key to this entire discussion and understanding why that is true, why that's the case. And also, I think just understanding that like our entire society is a settler colonial society. So the whole point of our entire civilization is to destroy or assimilate native people and make them disappear off the land so that we can have it and take it over. And that is such a fundamental thing about why we're even here, why we even exist, what our entire industrial complex is about, that it really does just always tie back to the need to like reproduce, the need to reproduce that settler colonial power. Everything in our whole society goes into it. I don't know where to begin. Like there's so many ways, there's so many of Allie's behaviors and there's so many behaviors of the followers and then just general circumstances that make a lot more sense when you understand what white supremacy is and how it's operating. Like the cosplaying as a cop and Joe Dispenza and just, white men abusing their
Mhm.
power in general, the fake tears, the crying tears to act like a victim performatively, fake shaman stuff, which goes into I want to talk about a particular article about decolonization that talks about settler moves to innocence. And I think that's one of them. And it's really important, not only because of Allie's history, but also because of the entire corner of TikTok that we were on or are on with all this kind of spiritual, what even is whitewash spirituality? What are the motivations for people to do that?
That list of things that you just listed down that Allie does, the cosplaying, the acting like a cop, acting like a southern preacher, like taking like cosplaying as male authoritative roles,
Yeah.
also specifically pointing to black women that are her targets and specifically calling black women scammers. If there's anything that has to do with a black woman that's at all involved in this situation that is not on Allie's side, and makes an income in any way, she specifically calls us scammers.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it's really sickening because, of course, there's already an imbalance that needs to be corrected for, and even like reparations are part of that. But just, I mean, it's disgusting to try to
Yeah,
really,
and she reserves that label only for Black women.
yeah. Did she call DJ a scammer too?
Yep.
Yeah, well,
Scamming people out of money for paying for manifestation coaching. I remember that.
that's very telling. I mean, especially considering the people in her own camp. And also, I mean, any Black women or Black people on her own side get tokenized, which is a whole other element, using a person as a token example of, or using, hey, I have a Black friend, to just excuse your behavior or to legitimize it in some way at your expense. The definition, again, the definition of scammer is somebody that's not aligned with Allie.
Yep, scammer and narcissist. If you're not on Allie's side, you are definitely those two things.
Yeah, I want to articulate more about that. Like there's so many things in our society that just are constant obstacles and deterrents to the survival of people of color and indigenous people. And to be consciously another one of those obstacles, I don't know. I don't have a word for it. But I mean, that's exactly what white supremacy is. I don't even know. That's not even what I want to say. It's like, do you think that it was even conscious? I think that it had to have been conscious to some degree, but I mean, some of that really could have just been weird implicit biases and lack of unpacking racism.
I think you're right that it's definitely a lack of unpacking um implicit bias, a lack of unpacking internalized racism and all of that. Conscious or not, she made choices that caused direct harm to BIPOC people atop a huge platform. And I feel like people that operate in that way, specifically white women that operate in that way, with that like Karen weaponized tears kind of way, I feel like she knew what she was doing. But if she had, I think if you have enough people in your echo chamber cheering you on and they all kind of look like you kind of rationalize it. Like the hatred, the fuel to seek revenge for not getting her way, all of that completely overshadowed any themes of racism that she could have possibly gave a shit about. It was about winning. It was about teaching everyone a lesson. It was about being right, and it was about clout and continuing to grow her platform. And I don't think there's any way that she did not know that what she was doing was causing direct harm to me as a Black person, as a Black content creator, because enough people called her out on it in the beginning where she changed her tune for half a second. And she definitely like switched up after being called out on the racism and the, what was it? Like, using my real name really early on and
Yeah.
people calling her out for the direct harm that could bring to me as a small Black creator on the platform. She knew that was a bad look. And I think prior to that moment, me being her only Black friend, probably her only Black friend ever, maybe, I don't know, she knew it was a bad look. And then slowly, people of color started to trickle into her side once they decided my story wasn't good enough. Then she went right back to it. Like, oh, there's Black people cheering me on, so everything that I'm doing must be fine. And Roxy's a piece of shit for calling me racist or implying that I'm racist or talking about racism. She's weaponizing every card, every Black card, disabled card, whatever. And my intersectionality did not matter as soon as she saw a Black person in her cheer section.
Yeah. I mean, she absolutely was tokenizing. She was definitely tokenizing you. And then she was definitely also tokenizing a lot of those I mean, any of her Black followers, because any time that somebody was Black and agreed with her, she would mention it and bring it up and use it as a cudgel. She also used Black
Mhm.
followers as a cudgel against me in calling me a white supremacist. But I mean, it really is just like
Ridiculous.
it's an abuse of those followers, whether they realize it or not, I think.
And what's crazy to me is that she cannot speak to racism, white deconstructing, decolonizing. She can't speak to it at all because she has never done the work ever. And people want to get, their panties in a bunch when you say, hey, this thing that you're doing is steeped. It reeks of white supremacy. They want to get more mad about being called out or being called in than actually doing the racist thing. And Allie is like a prime example. She's a glowing example of exactly that kind of behavior.
Yeah, there's a book called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. I'm going to put a couple of different sources and good like extended reading hopefully into the description, but that's one that became really popular in like 2018 and even into like 2020, and there's a critique of it which I'll include in the description too, but it talks about how whiteness wants always to just deflect from actually dealing with the situation. Like it's like constant moves to bypass. And I don't know, like I don't know that it's necessary to like sit in guilt and shame in a way that is not constructive, but you can't just bypass that work. And a big part of like the moves to white supremacy, I think, is just a defensive reaction that's pretty automatic and taught to us by all of society. Because again, society is like a machine and we're like cogs in this machine. So we're all kind of being programmed from birth or from learning language to turn like the cog we're supposed to be and make the machine keep going. And part of turning like that cog is that anytime something is going to disrupt the cog, like naming whiteness, that results in defensive reactions as a move to keep the machine going instead of to break it. So I think one of the main things that can be really unconscious, but is just like this gut defensive reaction, is centering yourself, thinking that it matters what your opinion is, or thinking that it matters that you win, that you have the final say, that you can control other people, like that compulsion, that you can save other people, that you can paternalistically know what is best for other people and then lay down the law
Mhm.
and punish them into no longer doing the bad thing because you know what the bad thing is. All of that is white supremacy, and all of that is such a it's so programmed into us because of everything that society is, because the whole goal of society is to perpetuate itself, and by itself it is white supremacy, so it's all about perpetuation. And
Mhm.
whiteness is a really interesting concept to name, and it's interesting to pay attention to what people feel defensive about, because when you get those like highly defensive reactions, that's pointing to something. It could, I think in general, when people
Mhm.
react really defensively, it's usually either pointing to something unjust happened, or it's pointing to something that was breaking the expectation, like the societal expectation happened. So whiteness is this like concept that is portrayed or framed as like everything and nothing at the same time. And we're not supposed to name it. Society doesn't want us to name it. So by naming it, that creates a lot of defensiveness in people, I think, when they're not used to it, when they haven't been exposed to representations of that, because it's just it's treated as the normal thing. And I think that that's really insidious, because you might think of like power as something that is superior. And so when you're looking around for something that is the powerful thing that you have to fight against, you're looking for something that states that it's above. And a lot of the insidiousness of whiteness is that it acts like it's not above, but just normal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so then there's like normal and difference, ethnic difference. And
Mm-hmm.
it even seems in some ways like we almost fail to question so often the common sense framing of whiteness as like outside of ethnicity, even like whiteness being inherently better than blackness, like white magic is better than black magic.
Mm-hmm.
We just assume those things are inherent properties of whiteness, that it's better, that it's normal, that it's the standard default. And that is a source of representational power. And I'll cite Richard Dyer in the description too, who talks about whiteness and basically just names it. He says white domination is reproduced by the way that white people colonize the definition of normal. So I think that idea of like colonization of the idea of normal, and
Mm-hmm.
that seeps into every other category, every other intersection. So when you're talking about class, gender, nationality, the invisibility of whiteness sits in there as like a colonizing aspect to the definition. We just assume that the white version of all of those things is the normal thing. When you can't see something, it makes it hard to control it, or it makes it hard to have power over it or take power back from it. Like the male gaze is the idea of seeing women in film the way that a man sees a woman. And it's like to see a woman the way a man sees a woman is to kind of have a control or a power over the woman. We talked about fetishization in the last episode. That's a kind of like move to control. And I think whiteness is always acting like the subject that is gazing outward at the other, at the object, and that itself is an aim to control. Bell Hooks is an author who talks about the oppositional gaze, which is like the gaze of, like, it's like a defiant kind of a gaze when it's coming from, say, a black woman back out at the world. It's like defying authority that pressures it to look down, pressures you to look away and not meet that gaze, and not like stand in your power, and not yourself be able to define and confine and categorize a white person. That kind of breaks the system for you to gaze and for you to define and categorize. There's like an implicit understanding that
Mm-hmm.
whiteness and white people are the arbiters of what is categorized, like what the categories are, and that they are the ones who get to look upon everybody else as an object. So I think naming, I'm being very long-winded because this is just like it's so much to explain, and I don't really know where people are. I think in 2023 most of us have like heard of white supremacy, but
You would think.
you would think. But I also think a lot of people don't read scholarship, and part of understanding white supremacy, I think, is definitely like lived experience. But there's also just a lot of like wishy-washy kind of almost even misuses of some of these terms that I think can all end up being kind of dangerous. So I like to go back to the scholarship a little bit, and particularly scholarship by Black feminist scholars, such as Kimberly Crenshaw, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde. But I think going back to the scholarship is like really important to not allow this all to kind of be misused and redirected and appropriated into something that's the exact opposite of the intent, because that is exactly what the impetus of society is to do all the time. So as soon as you're not like kind of vigilant about it, it's very easy to have all these terms misappropriated and misused. And I think we saw that with Allie too, just like using the term white
Mhm.
supremacy as a cudgel, and ultimately you're acting as a white supremacist. And how do you tell the difference between what Allie's doing and what we're talking about? Doesn't it all kind of sound the same? Well, it does, unless you actually know what these scholars have said about it, or just what, or else, unless you really have experienced it, I think too.
I think a
Um,
good first step, dipping your toes into the water of decolonizing and deconstructing and like facing your own internalized white supremacy and facing your own implicit bias and all of that, is the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. I've read that book, and it's a palatable first step towards getting your shit together when it comes to white supremacy. And she talks in depth, like you were mentioning, like how whiteness is just positioned as the norm. Like even starting, like going through elementary school, especially if you're in a very white area. Actually, it doesn't really matter where you are. School is just structured around whiteness, no matter the neighborhood that it's in, no matter the school district that it's in, no matter the socioeconomic positioning of that school, whiteness is the curriculum, point blank, period. But you are taught that whiteness is the norm and everyone else is the other. So to grow up in a society where, especially if you're white, where whiteness is what's normal, it's the standard, it's just what everything is, it's just whiteness, and everyone else is just everyone else, and you're the observer of all the others and the others problems, the others trials and tribulations, the others culture, the others issues, like looking through the window of a zoo. Like that's kind of how white people are taught to see people. I am normal and you are other. So to be faced with the reality that we are all something. We are all part of a puzzle. We are all something. It's not normal and other. I think in that moment, being faced with that as a white person that has never deconstructed any of this stuff, you can feel how gross it feels to be othered. No one wants to be othered, especially the standard that everyone else is compared to. They feel what that feels like briefly, being faced with, oh, I'm a part of a puzzle. I am part of a whole. I am not the whole and everyone else is on the outskirts and I'm just like looking down on them. Does that make sense?
yeah, it does make sense. And I definitely think white fragility is interesting. It kind of went in and out of fashion in academic circles kind of quick. And I think it's definitely like a really good place to start. And then it's also important not to like sit in that forever and to actually move from that into building up enough of a skin, I think, like working on your fragility to the point where you're not so fragile and you can actually perhaps help in some way. Although it's
Yeah,
all
I mean it's important. It's an important step to recognize what white fragility is and then take the next step to identify it in yourself. That's really important to do. And if that step isn't taken, it's going to be hard to hear anything else beyond that. If you're not healing your own fragility, if you're not doing that internal work first, it's going to be hard to hear anything else, because that book alone, I can imagine, can be really triggering for white people that are just getting started in this deep self work.
yeah. Yeah, and it takes ego deconstruction. It's a constant effort. Another book that's worth mentioning for sure right at the top is well, there's a lot of writing by it's Ibram X Kendi, and he builds a lot on Kimberly Crenshaw and then talks about anti-racism. So how to be anti-racist, and also has written articles and other books. So that is a really good author to get into if you're kind of new to like how do I start to deconstruct this stuff. But I think a really important thing to keep in mind, what do I even want to say? a really important thing to keep in mind is what is even the goals of all of this, and like I want to figure out
There's a lot.
how to get people to a next stage of being helpful with it. You know, I think one thing that's important to understand too is like about white saviorism. That's a really dangerous thing that white supremacy imbues a lot of white people with, is this feeling like we're destined to be the savior of other people. And that can play out in the way that we do foreign relations. And it can also play out in just the idea of, again, like white woman shamanism, or just thinking that what, you know, that this is how cult leaders are born, thinking that they're saving lives just by existing. They're protecting just by existing, not by doing, not by actually doing deconstructive work to act as a protector. They just are one. They just are entitled to being the savior of other people, which assumes that you know better than other people once again. So
And not only that, it's important to also deconstruct and identify what saving actually means. What does it mean to save someone? When you're the standard, when you're the norm, when you're what's right in your mind and in a very white society's thought process, what does saving actually mean? And what is the motivation behind that? To look at someone that doesn't look like you, doesn't pray like you, doesn't worship like you, doesn't experience joy like you, doesn't prioritize the same things you do, whose culture is different from yours, and you look at them and say, I need to save them, I need to rescue them. What are you doing? You're saying, I need to make them more like me, to make me more comfortable with them in my sphere. That's all that means. There is no saving that's what's so gross about white saviorism, because it's not actually about saving anyone. It's about making white people feel more comfortable in the presence of the other.
I would say yes, or even further, to destroy the other, to assimilate them or destroy them.
To strip the other, yeah.
Yeah. And to appropriate, to wear the skin of the other too, when it suits us.
Mhm.
And that's what a settler colonial society is. It's constantly making moves at every turn. Everything about what our society is always is meant to destroy or assimilate and use, tokenize and use up, and then kill.
Mhm.
That's what imperialism is, that's what colonization is, and that's really what our entire society therefore is. And the more, it's like a rabbit hole. It's like the more that you start to deconstruct, and it very much is ego deconstruction, the more that you do it, the more that you realize there is to do. That's, and I think that is always true, because that's the entire nature of the society, like in the very core of what quote unquote Western society is.
Mhm.
It's not some, you know, KKK group in the corner having these explicit beliefs and everybody else. No, it's everything about what our language is, what our laws are, what our society is. Unless you're actively moving in the opposite direction against it, unless you're taking an action that in some way reverses that, that in some way breaks the machine. Those are the only moments when you're being anti-racist instead of perpetuating a culture of racism.
Mhm.
You being me, you being white people, especially. And
Mhm.
then also there's an interesting and important distinction about Black politics and Indigenous politics. And I think it's another important term to really be careful about in these discussions is the term of decolonization. And that can be a really hard conversation for people, I think, when they're not ready for it. Like you have to do some of this ego construction or deconstruction, and then it's really difficult to sit with. But the reality is, decolonization doesn't just mean that we, you know, do SJW stuff and fight oppression in general, it's very specific. It's a reversal of colonization. It's land back. It's a reversal of our being on land that is stolen through violent means. So there's an article that completely changed my life that I'm also including in the description. It's called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. I think if anybody is like listening and wants to read anything from that, I would say that's my pick. It's by Eve Tuck and K. Wayne. You can never say it. It's by Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang. And it talks about settler moves to innocence, which are basically strategies that are constantly trying to allow settlers to relieve their feelings of guilt and responsibility without actually giving up land or power or privilege, and without having to change anything about our settler colonial society. So it turns out that pretty much everything that that we do is like these moves to innocence, in terms of like acting like we're decolonizing, but not actually understanding that the end goal is land back. Like we stop short because we say, oh, we're going to educate about decolonizing. We're going to educate. We're going to decolonize our minds, and it's literally just an attempt to make ourselves feel less guilty if we don't then take the next step. And I think the same thing about the White Fragility book. It's like the thing that kind of bothers me about it is that I feel like people get stuck there. I feel like people get stuck. Like, first of all, people get stuck on the stage of like, I can't even deal with this. I can't even sit here and take the idea that I shouldn't be the center of the world. Then people start to be like, okay, I've learned to do that enough. Then they get stuck on the end all be all being to sit there and feel guilty and feel flagellated and be a martyr. That becomes the final step. Even that is an attempt to assuage your guilt. Instead of do the actual thing of get to the end and deconstruct enough that we're actually, as a society, collectively deconstructed enough, and then the end goal is land back. And I think that that's very difficult, because then you get into the practice of like, what does that actually mean? And it takes deconstruction to even begin to be able to be helpful in the actual endeavor of decolonization. It takes deconstruction. And it takes not just it's never going to be an individual who can just solve the whole problem. It's a collective problem, and it takes a collective solution that individuals can try to all move us toward, hopefully, until there's like a tipping point or whatever that looks like. But yeah, I just think it's very important not to stop short, or I guess not to let yourself off the hook, and not in a way that's just like, again, like if I'm going to sit here and be like, oh, I'm not off the hook, but I feel so guilty, then I get stopped up in that guilt and I'm not actually doing anything. And that's still, it's still an attempt to assuage.
I mean, that's white fragility still.
Yeah,
exactly. It's just more being fragile.
Exactly. So it's like, you gotta move past all of that and get to the real end, which isn't even just decolonizing your mind, like, whatever. It's land back. It's reparations. And also, I mean, again, like Black anti-oppression politics is not exactly the same thing as decolonization. That article also talks about like a settler slave indigenous, what's the third word? Anyway, it's like the people that were brought over to this country are in kind of a different camp from indigenous people, while also having their own kind of issues. But I think that that's very important to understand, and not just sort of muddy the word decolonization and muddy all of these ideas together. And there's a couple of like list of moves to innocence that this article lists that I think is good to maybe bring up and discuss, because I won't do them all, but I'll just list the first four. So the first one is settler nativism, which is like where white people are like, oh, I have some kind of long lost Native American ancestor, or I was even able to find one in my bloodline or something. And so it makes you feel like you're less complicit or less guilty or something. And that's a very, very common strategy, weirdly common. I will even admit in my own family, I was told and did deconstruct that it wasn't true, that there was a mythical Indian princess ancestor. Like that's a very, very common weird myth in white families. And even if it's not a myth, even if you, I think it can be really a beautiful thing to find your ancestry roots and start to get back in touch with them, but it can still be used as a weapon or a move to innocence, even for people where it's actually true that they have that kind of ancestry. If they are disconnected from their people, you still probably need to do some deconstruction, even though that
Mhm.
is a beautiful thing. And anyway, so that's the first one. And then there's settler adoption fantasies, which is not related to ICWA, which woohoo, by the way. Woo. Um, the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is gonna I think protect a lot of indigenous children from being assimilated, which is the whole goal of white supremacy, right?
Mhm.
But this is not, settler adoption fantasies is not the same thing as that, as like adopting native children. It's the adoption of indigenous practices and knowledge, but also like fantasies, like white people having fantasies that native people understand that they are going extinct, and they just nobly hand over the land and even like a native identity to the white people. It's like a weird idea, and that manifests in things like adopting indigenous practices and knowledge and appropriating them, like for example a fake white woman shaman, right? That comes
You
from,
remember when we found that like shaman school website?
yeah,
It was like an old white guy
it's like a weird concentration of fake white woman shamans in Denver. Allie talked about that a little bit, and she's
in
not
Boulder.
wrong because we looked into it and it's like a weird amount of white lady shamans in Denver. Weird.
Mhm. More specifically, Boulder, Colorado.
Oh yeah, okay. I've never been to Colorado and I don't really understand the city, the places in it, so sorry about that. Um Specifically Colorado, that's what I know.
Yeah.
But yeah, like a weird and very corporatized, very capitalist. Yeah. So then another move to innocence is colonial equivocation. So it's like this is the one that is like the homogenizing various experiences of oppression as colonization. So the article says calling different groups colonized without describing their relationship to settler colonialism is an equivocation. Which we talked about in the fallacy episode. It's all tying in.
Mhm.
The fallacy of using a word in different senses at different stages of reasoning. In particular, describing all struggles against imperialism as decolonizing creates a convenient ambiguity between decolonization and social justice work, especially among people of color, queer people, and other minoritized groups. So, and then it says, and I think this is an interesting passage, we are all colonized may be a true statement, but it is deceptively embracive and vague in its inference that none of us are settlers. So we are all colonized, but it doesn't mean that we're innocent of the colonization.
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
yeah, so I think that's a really important point. And then, yeah, and then another move to innocence is just free your mind and the rest will follow. That and just remembering that decolonizing our minds is a first step and a very important one, and it's a lifelong endeavor, and it's also not the only step to decolonization. It does not end there. So I
It's
love
not
that
a
article.
passive thing. It's not a passive thing at all. It's work to decolonize. And it's not enough to be or to say, well, I'm not racist and I don't have friends that are racist and I don't think racism is good and I wouldn't participate in that. That's not enough. You have to be actively anti racist. And that's something that I didn't even realize until what 2016 when Trump was elected and all these racist people suddenly like were just so loud and proud about their white supremacy and about their racism and about not being politically correct about anything and being so unapologetically ignorant. And I had like experienced some racism growing up. I grew up in like an extremely white area. My parents were immigrants. Like I would be the only black kid in many of my classes for many years of my schooling. I think in my graduating class, I think there was 5 black people in my graduating class out of like 1,200 students. So, yeah, I've definitely experienced racism my whole life, but it's the socially acceptable, covert, like deniable racism that really hurts and that is really a problem because there's not a lot of overt racism going around because it's not a good look. It's not a good look at all, but when it's socially acceptable and there's some deniability on your side and you can kind of laugh it off as a joke or a misunderstanding or a person of color just being too sensitive, that's the shit that's a problem and just as harmful and just as dangerous for BIPOC people. So it's not enough to say, "Oh, well, I'm not racist. I'm not part of the KKK. I don't know anybody that does that." You That's not the thing that is the big, glaring, flaming, smoking problem.
You have to be actively anti-racist, and that's why I really love Kendi's writing, because how he talks about that in a way that is he talks about that in a way that's, I think, really accessible and makes it very I don't it makes sense why you have to be anti-racist rather than thinking about it like you're actively racist at some point. And I think that's just such an important thing to understand, that it's like you're stepping in like a river and you have to swim upstream or else you're going to get carried down the stream.
Mhm.
And I also think the concept of dog whistling is important to bring up too here, because you were saying about how they won't be explicit when they know that they'll get opposition.
Mhm.
And so a dog whistle is this idea of like coded or suggestive language. I'm looking at the Wikipedia page of the definition in to garner support of a particular group, but also not provoke opposition. And I notice that a lot with right wing rhetoric and
Mhm.
fascist rhetoric and authoritarian rhetoric. All of that is like trying to say it's never just being open and honest about what it thinks. It's
Mhm.
always acting like it thinks the exact opposite of what it actually thinks, which is like a weird gaslight, but it's like the entire tactic of how all that rhetoric gets spread. It's just it's like you have to imagine that that the people that are spreading that kind of rhetoric are conscious of it. But I think there must be tiers of people, and some people just get gaslit into thinking that up is down.
Mhm.
But part of the way of doing that is through dog whistling, and that's where you're using, and I've even been somebody who has done this. I'm guilty of having done this in my life, and it's easy to do, of accidentally dog whistling or not even realizing that what you're saying is a dog whistle, which I think in a way you're not then dog whistling. But if you don't understand that you're like partaking in something because you think it means something that you don't understand that it has certain layers of meaning, you're still
Mhm.
contributing to something that can be harmful. So, and it's easy to feel defensive if somebody's like, oh, what you're saying is a dog whistle, or what you're saying is actually like, and you don't think that it is. But you have to understand the cultural context of the language. And I have done this, so I know that it's not difficult to start using terminology or thinking of things in a certain way, and it turns out you got gaslit. Turns out you got
Yeah.
like brainwashed by dog whistling and by just like it's literally like presenting as the opposite of what it means.
Right.
Like somebody acting like a white supremacist while also weaponizing the SJW concept of white supremacy at other people, at the same time. That's like a weird gaslight. And it's like a very, very common tactic of fascist behavior.
I mean, that's why it's so important to educate yourself and pay attention to history, not just not just the forefathers and what Thanksgiving was and the whitewashed Disney version of American history. It's important to learn the entire history from the multiple groups of people that exist in this society. There's so much they want to call America a melting pot. Well, recognize that it's not a melting pot. It's actually more of a salad. We're not all melted together. We're not all one at all. And this that's why when people I'm so glad that people have called this out and, like, have stomped this out of language, but to say, "Oh, I don't see color," like, I'm so glad that's not a thing. That's a thing that gets interrupted, like, you can't skate by on that anymore. You have to recognize color. You have to recognize diversity. We're not all the same. We don't all have the same experiences, and because of that, you would think people would be more inclined to stay curious and to learn the real history of how we all ended up here and how institutionalized racism works and how it's still at play in every like it's baked into the cake of what this country is. So it always kind of surprises me when you try to be helpful and educate people when they do mess up, when they do accidentally dog whistle, when they do say something that's really offensive or like racially offensive and they don't know because it's so normalized amongst their friends and family to say certain things and then they say it in mixed company and then get defensive when it offends someone. I think a lot of people have just been socialized to say, well, you're just being too sensitive or why does everything have to be about race? And you get all this pushback from for trying to educate. Why are people so resistant to learning, like taking on new information and growing from there? When I think now more than ever, I mean, I believe now more than ever in the history of our society, people are willing to educate. People are willing to call in and not necessarily burn you at the stake. Like, what an opportunity to grow and learn and do better and create a better society for everyone, a more inclusive society for everyone and extend equity when you can. I don't know why anyone would be resistant to that. Not that anyone owes anyone else kindness when it comes to being a racist piece of shit. I don't owe you politeness or gentleness. I don't need to handle you with kid gloves. But when people do choose to do that, like some people don't wanna receive it, and that's really disappointing to encounter that, especially when I see it happening on TikTok every fucking day. There is so much white supremacy on that app, and when people say, "Oh, it's just the boomers," it's that generation and they're dying off. Racism's dying off. It's not really a thing. No, fuck you. These racist people have procreated and they have children and their children have children. That shit gets passed down when no one is deconstructing. When I see huge TikTok creators that are like 22 saying things like, "Oh, slavery wasn't that bad." I think they're embellishing how bad slavery was. I think some slaves had really great relationships with their masters. You just said slave and master and good relationship in the same fucking sentence. Don't tell me the boomers are the racist ones and they're the ones dying off. No, they're the ones having children and passing this shit down. Like it's in the Gen Z crowd, white supremacy and these shit takes being spewed from huge platforms and being indoctrinated into even the even younger generation. Like it's still a problem. So being passively not okay with racism, again, I'm going to say it 20 times in this episode. It is not enough. You have to be actively anti racist. You have to call it out. You have to interrupt it. You have to get your people. White people need to do more and do better and like gather your people up and tell them what's what because they need to get their shit together, honestly. I hate seeing younger and younger and younger people doing white supremacist shit on social media.
I agree. And there is a lot there's pipelines all over the place. There's all that Andrew Tate stuff. There's a lot of weird stuff wrapped up in modern conceptions of masculinity.
Yeah, there's a lot of historical revisionism going on
Yeah.
everywhere.
Yeah.
You can't just rewrite history. You really can't. But with people consuming short form content now, and that's the only way people are like absorbing information with TikTok, especially TikTok and maybe even YouTube shorts. People are taking these really short snippets of out of context information, and that's how they're getting their like education, sort of. Like it's like micro education on TikTok. And information spreads like wildfire when it's in short form content. And a good portion of that short form wildfire content is steeped in white supremacy, and that's terrifying.
Yeah. Plus, I think, again, going back to this idea of fetishization being taking a part of the whole and just like removing it and putting it out of context, it's a very similar thing to what happens when you just see one little 30-second clip out of somebody's TikTok content. And it's that's very easy to, I think that there is like a natural tendency of the energy of something like that to move toward white supremacy unless you are very active in the other direction. And active can look like a lot of things. And I think at this point TikTok is becoming more and more like a lost cause in that regard. So some of it is just like understanding that cultivating a space that does not center whiteness and white supremacy. And I don't know that TikTok can be that space or can be for very long, can be in a sustained way, but you can cultivate your following, you can be actively aware of or try to be. I mean, it's very difficult. Like that's such a vast app and everything is so out of context that it takes a lot of legwork to even come up with like strategies that you're going to follow through with to try to use your platform if you have one in an anti-racist way, or even just to cultivate a following in a community that's doing something helpful, that's like that is not centering whiteness. These things take a lot of effort. I remember there was like a whole thing, a couple, when I first got on there, there was some sort of challenge of like, what's your watch history? What's your like history? How many black faces and white faces are in that history? And a lot of people were getting called out. And other people were performatively putting up their like history pages. But uh that's just an example of like not bragging about it, but just literally taking action to actively cultivate your feed, to have a sense of the context of the and the political views of the people that you're following. And you can't be everything, you can't be perfect at it. But maybe that's part of the reason why TikTok just doesn't even work as a very sustainably healthy community building space and anti-racist space that's actually doing anything productive. Like I think there was more at the beginning, because when you need fast information, there's something really beautiful about not having to get it through mainstream media sources all of a sudden. But it feels like it has become stale. It feels like people are exhausted of this short form content, because you really can't learn history through short form content, because short form content is all about just manipulating your emotions real quick and it's gone as soon as it comes, and you're not learning very much. I don't think you're learning a ton no matter who you follow on TikTok. I think you kind of have to learn outside of TikTok, and then you can be relatively conscious or not of how that content is wielding your emotions.
Oh,
But
I think when it comes to big issues like this one, like racism and white supremacy and all of these different topics under white supremacy, as a white person, like I could see a lot of people thinking they can just get by on getting a quick history, a quick rundown on what I can do better in 30 seconds. what I can do better in like a memeified, easily consumable way. I can see people trying to scrape by on that with an app like TikTok, not having to really do deep dives and really do the work. Just, have that like history as a flex. Oh, look at all these people that I follow. And, try to do the bare minimum when you're the norm, when you're the societal standard, when you're the neurotypical standard, when you're white and these things don't actually negatively impact you in a significant way. Why not try to get by with, a memeified version of an education?
Well, and it is like a good that's a good question because it's like why would you care if you're not the person affected? But I think when you learn the history, what you realize is that it does affect us all. And I think when the people that are the most marginalized and the most disadvantaged by our society, when we make corrections, when we move in the direction of giving them space to survive and exist and even thrive, the people that are the most marginalized at the most outskirts, which is essentially trans, indigenous, or BIPOC, Black people, especially women and femmes, and people that are class wise that are marginalized below the poverty line or subaltern. When you make moves to get those people to a place where within our society they are able to survive and thrive, then that helps everybody else. When you make moves to help just the person closest to the center, that only helps the person close to the center, nobody else. And I think that's a point that Kimberly Crenshaw makes really well. To read some of her writing, it really does, and you can see that when you understand history, when you learn history, you can see that that really is how it works, and that the best problem solvers of our society are the people that experience some of that marginalization when they're able to actually have a voice and contribute to, have a say in what would be best and how the society should operate. And we really are in dire circumstances. I mean, this is a terrifying time to live through. Climate change is terrifying. Philadelphia was like, the skies were burning. Like, Canada's fires came down into Philadelphia the other week. And for the first time, I think, that I've ever experienced anywhere on the East Coast, the sky, it was like sepia tones, the sun was all red, and everybody had, we were all coughing, it smelled like a bonfire because Canada was on fire, and the West Coast was just like, yeah, that's old hat.
Yeah, first time, huh?
Yeah, but
Yeah.
it's like literally hell. And then like, this is wild times that we're living through, and it's because the world is about to have to reset if we don't quit it, because we're doing so badly because of who we put in charge. It's not going great.
Mhm.
This is dire. This is like a some things are not even reversible about that situation. And
Yeah.
it is beyond time to start listening to other people who might have solutions that work for everybody and not just some people, because when you think it's going to work for you, it's not going to work for you. Nobody is actually at the center. I think I've said this before, but this is like my big theory. You think you're at the center, you think you're entitled, you're going to be disappointed because
Yeah.
you're not really at the center no matter who you are. Something puts you outside of the center, and so you are not benefiting from how things have been going. This has not worked, and it is definitely time, it's beyond time for change.
It's
But
beyond time for change, and I don't know how many more wake-up calls it'll take because I feel like our generation, millennials specifically, have experienced so much trauma year after year, decade after decade. Like, so much shit has happened
yeah.
in our little 30 something, 40 something lifespan so far, or time here so far. And if it wasn't a few summers ago, nearly, like, I don't know, 40% of the world was on fire. The entire, all of Australia was on fire one summer. And like, most of California was on fire. If that didn't wake people up, like seeing photos of little baby koalas like scorched and burned and people just driving through what looked like hell, recording on their phones, just driving through, just you can see the sky. You could just see flames and
I remember
smoke.
that.
Like if that didn't wake people up, if COVID didn't fucking wake people up that something needed to change, uh
Or the George Floyd protests. That was apocalyptic. That was a huge shift in energy. And I think things have been changing in waves, but it's still going and still needs to go.
but it's like until your backyard is smoking, I mean, people don't really care until it's literally in their backyard. And even then, it might even have to be in the house for them to wake up and be like, oh, this is actually gonna burn me. Maybe I should do something. And even then, it's still self preservation. It's not like an outward, we should do something to make the world better for everyone. Even when it's so close, it's still just about me, me, me. And that's not helping.
That's another really important like tenet of white supremacy is individualism versus collectivism. I don't remember if we talked about that yet, but like the idea that anything is about you as an individual as opposed to my theory is that we're all one. It's not my theory, but a theory that I ascribe to is that we are all one thing. We are all one species. We are all one organism. You are me. So I shouldn't be hurting you because I'm hurting me.
Are you tired of feeling unsafe online? Do you want to learn how to protect yourself from cyberbullying, doxing, and other forms of online harassment? Then look no further than Doxxed the Podcast. Visit the website doxxedthepodcast.com to sign up for the Doxxed free ebook full of helpful tips and resources for online safety. Plus, when you sign up, you'll receive the weekly newsletter with the latest updates on upcoming content. There are many ways to connect with Doxxed, including Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Discord. Have a story to share or feedback to give? Use the contact form on the site to reach out or leave a voice message to be featured on the show. And for exclusive content, subscribe to the Doxxed Supercast to gain access to the private podcast feed with member-only exclusives. Take control of your online safety and join the Doxxed community today.
And I think it's a trick to think that we as individuals, and we're set up for failure that way. That's why so many child prodigies fail, because it's not about anybody as an individual. Genius is a myth. It's like a white supremacist myth that some people are just higher up than others uniquely. No, it all was a complete, like, not a complete product of their environment, but it's not, it's literally a nationalist myth, the myth of individual genius. Like you think about geniuses, Mozart, Einstein, um, Beethoven. What do they have in common? They're from Germany and Vienna, like, and they're white and they're men. I mean, this is the picture of genius. Like they're it's a myth designed to promote this concept of white supremacy and that some people are better than others and that there's some kind of hierarchy. So anyway, that's, yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Like understanding that the good of the collective is your good. I think that we all are set up to believe that that's not how we should be operating, and it's like everyone for themselves. And you it's like a rewriting of history to say that just those individual people were the people that change history instead of it being movements and also the things going on domestically, the women behind the scenes running things, doing the household, making sure everybody was fed and making sure, raising children so that they could continue to we could continue to exist. Like those things are all part of history too. But yeah, it's a myth of individualism. That's what I want to say.
That's another thing about white supremacy and women. White supremacy and white women. White supremacy doesn't give a shit about white women. Women in general, but you would think as a white woman you'd have some like the proximity to power would offer some kind of like protection. Absolutely not. White supremacy doesn't serve anyone but white men, American-born white men. I was listening to the podcast series Bundyville.
Mhm.
It's amazing. It's like a Netflix series in just audio. It's so great. It's about this family in God, I can't remember what state. I'm not gonna butcher it. I'm gonna really try hard to summarize it. It's about this family that they had this like dispute with the government over not paying grazing fees for their cattle on public land. Like they had a relatively small ranch, but let their cattle just kind of roam everywhere on public land to eat, I guess, to graze. Like you're supposed to pay for that because it's BLM land and they felt entitled to not pay. So they were really like anti government and felt like they had a right to use public land without any kind of oversight, which is just not how it works. And the sentiment was like really mixed in with like white supremacist ideologies. And they had a lot of supporters that held really strong beliefs in like states' rights and what do they call it? Some kind of sovereignty. What's that term called? Oh, sovereign citizen.
Oh,
They
okay.
believed in being a sovereign citizen and they shouldn't have to follow the laws or whatever. It's like this really, and they had a really like distorted interpretation of the Constitution and just kind of leaned into whatever reinforced their like their whiteness and their like patriarchal dominance that they felt they had over everyone. So the series like it really highlights the various extremist groups and militias all around the country that rallied around this Bundy family. And it's just wild. But they play a lot of clips of these like standoffs that they had with the police, like shooting at the cops shooting at them, like bombs going off. Like it was like Waco, basically. I don't know if you saw that. I don't know if it was like a Hulu or Netflix thing that kind of covered the whole Waco thing, but it's very much like Waco. It's very much like the Oklahoma City bombing. Like they're all kind of tied into this this Bundy situation. But in one of the clips that they were playing on the podcast of people being shot and the standoff that they were having with the cops, one of the main guys was like, their strategy was to put women on the front lines if the cops started shooting at them to appeal to the emotions of the public. Like, oh, look,
Hmm.
they shoot at women and they shoot at our children, they killed our babies. Like, they were absolutely
Yeah. That's
making
insidious.
women and children the sacrificial lambs for their cause.
Yeah, that's so insidious. Ugh.
Gross. Saying it with their whole chest. Like, we put women on the front lines when the cops start shooting. Disgusting.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, I don't think that we benefit whatsoever from the white patriarchy. I mean, it is. It's like a limited level of proximity to the power, but our real power as women does not derive from anything in that system, I would say. And just to reiterate that really, I don't think anyone's at the center. I think that even when you're a white man, you can still be poor, and it's not like an oppression that excuses you from anything, but you're still not exactly at the center. You're still not the thing that you even society is telling you that you're entitled to all this stuff because of. And it doesn't benefit you either. You would still be better off. Even if you are just one iota from the center, you would still be better off with a society. And I think people are really afraid of that. I had an ex who had a chronic illness, and we had a discussion about the broken medical insurance system in this country. And I was saying that we should just have care for all. And he was like pushing back on that. And I was like, yeah, but like you have like a chronic illness. What if you like lost your job, like you would not have to be so concerned with your job, and you would be in less danger because you would have more of a safety net. And he was like, yeah, but what if it would disrupt my care just to do the transition into this other system of healthcare? And it was just like mind blowing to me that you would think that you're just like, I don't know, like I think it was a fear. It was coming out of a place of fear because it's a person who was otherwise like very empathetic, but was really having this like personal, like, well, it becomes kind of like a life or death feeling for me personally. And then I can't think outside of that. But really that person would,
Mm-hmm.
I think that person would have benefited still from that kind of a change. Yeah.
I had a similar conversation with my most recent ex. Yeah, my ex had type 1 diabetes, and I'd never known anyone personally, or like intimately, that has type 1. And that means there's people with type 2 in my family, and it's totally self-induced. They totally did it to themselves with diet or whatever, and they manage it. They can reverse it if they made changes, but they choose not to. It's very different than having type 1, which is you're either born with it or just there's a sudden onset and there is no reversing it, and you're on insulin for the rest of your life. And you need insulin to live. And it didn't really dawn on me like, oh, you need insulin to live. You need a constant supply of insulin and it's not free. And if you don't have it, you don't live for very long, like maybe a day without your insulin, and there's nothing you can do to manage it. So like that became like a real thing for me being in relationship with someone with type 1, and I was like, "Oh man, that's a way of life I wouldn't wish on anyone." Like that's horrible to like if you had insurance through your job and you lost your job, you would have to come up with like thousands of dollars to have a constant supply of insulin, and it expires. Like you can't just stockpile it either. And so we're talking about like the idea of like universal healthcare and how it would save so many lives specifically for type 1 diabetics. And he was like he had the same response like that your ex had, well, what about me? Or what if I can't be seen on time? Like
Yeah.
he was talking about universal healthcare in other countries and how people have to wait so long to be seen. And so he very much went into, well, what about me? I wouldn't want that. I like being in control of my healthcare and da da da. But I'm like, well, you're also an employee for a big corporation. And if they decide you're not valuable anymore, you won't have that healthcare anymore. But if it was universal, that would never be a concern. But
Yeah.
still, it was just, well, what about me?
Yeah, and yeah, when you are disabled in any way or you have any kind of chronic illness, there could really easily become a time at some point that you can't even know or determine that you can't work. And this country makes it very dangerous for people to be in that position.
Mm-hmm.
Really does. So, but I think it's because of fear. I think it was, and a real fear
Mm-hmm.
when it really comes, and that's what going back to this, these ideas of decolonizing, like I think that's where it really is an incredibly deep fear because the thought is, okay, if it's land back, what happens to me?
Mm-hmm.
What happens to what happens what how do I take care of myself and still be comfortable and still whatever? And that is not the point. But there is an incredible just it takes a lot of deconstruction to move past, I think, what is a very deep-seated fear when it comes to your own survival. And then that can make you, I think, defensive, and it can make you
Yeah.
sometimes unable to think past it.
And now
And
that I'm thinking about it, now that you're talking about this, like I've encountered so many what about me moments specifically from white people in like various situations, various conversations about various scenarios.
yeah,
This reminds me of that one awful summer where every other weekend there was a new hashtag of a black person that had been murdered by the police. Like it was Facebook was just a hellhole of trauma,
yeah,
of videos of black people dying. And an old acquaintance of mine was weighing in on a post. I think it was particularly about Philando Castile. That was a big one. And her boyfriend at the time was a cop. And I'm reading through these comments, and she was like, well, if my man was in that situation, I would want him to shoot first and ask questions later. Like, what about my boyfriend? If he was in that situation, I would want him to shoot. Like, completely missing the point that there needed to be no shooting at all. No one needed to die for any reason. Like, there was no reason for a whole, like, hair trigger thing and taking someone's life. It was a senseless murder of someone. But the sentiment even then was, well, what about my boyfriend? He's a cop too. I would want him to shoot. There was another situation with an old client of mine when I had my lash studio, and there was a shooting down the street from my salon, and it had made the news, and we were talking about it. And there was another client in the room saying that she had a friend that was scared that someone was lurking around her home, or that someone like had ran past her home, like they were in trouble or something, and it scared her. So because they were a black person, instead of calling the police to look into it, she called the fire department to come and explain to them that there was something going on and she didn't quite know what. And the fire department came, and then the police came, and the fire department had explained to the police what was going on, and so it wasn't this whole suddenly escalated thing. My client's husband was a firefighter, and she chimed in, well, I wouldn't want someone to call my husband to come and put him in danger. Don't call the fire department. What if my husband shows up? Like, so annoying.
Yeah. Really centering it's just like a complete compulsion to center yourself at all times.
Yeah. Gross.
It is gross. And it's like, it's just, it's something you have to, you have to practice. You have to deconstruct if you're growing up, and that's just what you have to practice. It takes work, do the work, but you can do it. It's really, you can retrain your brain. It definitely starts off as just a gut compulsion based on, how do I say it? Like just a compulsion.
I mean, it's like going against the grain of society, though, that teaches white people to center themselves because they are the center of the world. As a global minority, it's very weird that white people are centered themselves so much and make themselves the standard for everything. The European standard is like a global standard, but in the grand scheme, white people are the global minority.
Yeah.
There are way more people of color, way more like other cultures, other ethnicities than just European people
Yeah.
or white people as a like a social construct.
Yeah. But the reason that society is teaching us to do that, again, is not actually to benefit us. It's to benefit the machine of society
Mhm.
at the end of the day. Because these
Mhm.
things really are toxic. We convince ourselves that there's some sort of superiority in white ways of being. We being our society.
Thank you for listening. Find additional content at doxedthepodcast.com.